history leaves long shadows. Some are visible, openly discussed, and carefully examined. Others remain quietly embedded in everyday language, customs, and social systems rarely named, yet deeply felt. This story begins in that shadowed space, where the past has not fully loosened its grip on the present. Across centuries, trade routes, empires, and belief systems shaped entire regions. Alongside culture and knowledge, they also carried hierarchy ideas about who belonged at the top and who was expected to serve. In many Arab societies, the legacy of the Arab slave trade is not only a historical footnote. Critics argue it helped normalize attitudes that continue to influence how black people are perceived and treated today. These influences are subtle at times, overt at others, and often dismissed as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of a deeper pattern. This is not a story about blaming a people or a culture. It is a story about confronting uncomfortable truths about how history can quietly shape social norms, how silence can reinforce injustice, and how discrimination can survive long after laws and empires have fallen. From everyday interactions to institutional practices, many voices claim that anti-black racism has been allowed to blend into normal life, unquestioned and unchallenged. Why does this matter now? Because racism does not exist in the past tense. It affects where people can live, how they are treated at work, how safe they feel walking down the street, and whether their dignity is recognized. Ignoring it does not make it disappear, it allows it to evolve. In this video, we will explore these claims carefully, grounding the discussion in history, lived experiences, and documented patterns. The goal is not outrage, but understanding, not division, but awareness. Because meaningful change begins when difficult conversations are finally brought into the light. If you value thoughtful discussions that challenge assumptions and give voice to overlooked realities, support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive. The shadow of history does not remain confined to textbooks. It often reveals itself in the quiet routines of everyday life. After understanding how deeply rooted ideas can become normalized over time, the story moves from the past into the present, where these inherited attitudes surface in ordinary moments that rarely make headlines. In cities celebrated for their modern skylines and global diversity, many black Africans describe a reality that contrasts sharply with the image projected to the world. For some, the first encounter comes while searching for a place to live. Apartments are advertised as available. Conversations begin politely, and documents are ready. Yet the tone changes the moment face-to-face meetings occur. Explanations become vague, availability suddenly disappears, or rules emerge that were never mentioned before. Those who experience this repeatedly begin to recognize a pattern, one that has little to do with finances or legal status and everything to do with appearance. The message is rarely spoken directly, but it is clearly understood. Some doors remain closed long before any personal story can be heard. Workplaces, too, reflect these unspoken hierarchies. Black Africans often recount being overqualified for positions they are discouraged from applying for, or being confined to roles with limited visibility and advancement. Regardless of performance, praise may come quietly, while criticism arrives publicly, shaping an environment where confidence is slowly worn down. These experiences are not always dramatic, but their cumulative effect is profound, reinforcing the sense that worth is being measured by something far more superficial than skill or character. Beyond housing and employment, social interactions carry their own weight. A glance that lingers too long, a joke framed as harmless curiosity, or a sudden shift in body language on public transport can speak volumes. Over time, these moments create a constant awareness of being watched, evaluated, or kept at a distance. Many describe learning to navigate public spaces with restraint, choosing silence over confrontation, and adapting their behavior simply to avoid discomfort or misunderstanding. What makes these experiences especially difficult is their ambiguity. Rarely are they accompanied by explicit statements, making them easy to dismiss or explain away. Yet when shared among those who live through them, the similarities are striking. Different voices, different backgrounds, and different journeys converge around the same themes of exclusion and conditional acceptance. This shared reality suggests that the issue is not individual misfortune, but a broader social pattern shaped by long-standing perceptions. In linking these present-day testimonies to the historical context already explored, a clearer picture emerges. The past does not dictate every action, but it influences the frameworks through which people see one another. When certain groups have been historically associated with servitude or inferiority, those associations can quietly persist, shaping expectations and behaviors even in societies that pride themselves on progress and tolerance. These stories are not told to inspire resentment, but to illuminate a reality that often remains invisible to those who do not experience it firsthand. By listening closely, the narrative shifts from abstract discussions of history to the human cost of unexamined attitudes. It is in these lived experiences that the legacy of the past becomes tangible, reminding us that confronting history is not only about acknowledging what once was, but about understanding how it continues to shape the world we share today. As the story widens beyond individual cities and personal encounters, a larger pattern comes into view, one that challenges the idea that anti-Black racism exists only within a single cultural or racial framework. The experiences already described do not stand alone. They echo across borders, languages, and belief systems, revealing a phenomenon that is far more global than it is often assumed to be. When examined closely, these patterns suggest that anti-Blackness is not confined to traditional narratives of white versus black relations, but has been absorbed and reproduced in many parts of the world. In parts of Europe, for example, Black communities often find themselves positioned as perpetual outsiders, regardless of citizenship, education, or contribution to society. Incidents involving public figures, political discourse, or media portrayals periodically expose how deeply rooted certain assumptions remain. These moments are frequently framed as scandals or exceptions, yet they resonate precisely because they confirm what many already live with daily: a sense that Blackness is treated as something to be explained, managed, or feared rather than simply accepted. The language may differ from place to place, but the underlying logic remains strikingly familiar. Moving eastward, similar dynamics in Asian contexts, where histories of colonial influence, color-based hierarchies, and social stratification intersect in complex ways. In some societies, darker skin has long been associated with lower social status, manual labor, or foreignness, shaping attitudes that predate modern globalization. When Black Africans arrive as students, workers, or travelers, they often step into frameworks that are already predisposed to see them through lenses of suspicion or inferiority. These perceptions do not require personal hostility to function. They operate quietly through social norms, institutional practices, and collective habits of thought. What links these diverse settings is not a shared culture or ideology, but a shared inheritance of ideas about value and belonging. Anti-Blackness, in this sense, operates like a global language with many dialects. It adapts to local histories and customs while maintaining a consistent core: the devaluation of Black lives and experiences. This adaptability is precisely what allows it to persist, often unchallenged, even in societies that publicly reject racism as a moral failing. By connecting these global examples to the earlier testimonies from the Middle East, the narrative gains a deeper coherence. The discrimination faced by Black Africans in housing, employment, and social life is not an isolated anomaly. Nor is it uniquely regional. It is part of a wider system of meaning that has traveled across centuries and continents, reshaped by empire, trade, religion, and modern media. Each society adds its own texture to this system, but none exist entirely outside it. Understanding anti-Blackness as a global phenomenon reframes the conversation in an important way. It shifts the focus from assigning blame to examining structures, from individual prejudice to collective responsibility. It also invites a more honest reckoning with how interconnected the modern world truly is in an era of migration, digital communication, and cultural exchange. Harmful ideas move just as easily as beneficial ones. This broader perspective does not dilute the pain of individual experiences. It amplifies their significance. Each story becomes part of a larger human narrative, one that reveals how deeply ingrained hierarchies can survive under different names and faces. Only by recognizing the global nature of this issue can meaningful dialogue begin, one that moves beyond denial and defensiveness toward a clearer understanding of how the past continues to shape the present, and how awareness can become the first step toward change. As the narrative continues to unfold across borders, one incident stands out for the way it exposes how race and faith can intersect to intensify vulnerability. After tracing the global patterns of anti-Blackness in different cultural settings, the story arrives in India, where African students pursuing education found themselves caught in a moment that revealed how quickly suspicion can turn into collective aggression. What makes this episode especially significant is not only the violence itself, but the context in which it occurred. These students were not engaged in protest or confrontation. They were gathered for Ramadan prayers, a quiet and deeply personal act of worship shared by millions of Muslims around the world. In that moment, they embodied two identities at once. They were Black, and they were Muslim. Rather than offering protection or neutrality, this combination appeared to mark them as targets. Their presence was questioned, their right to pray challenged, and their safety abruptly compromised. The setting, meant to provide a sense of community and belonging, instead became a place of fear. For many observers, the incident disrupted familiar assumptions. India is often discussed in terms of religious tension, caste dynamics, or nationalism, but race is less frequently acknowledged as a driving factor in public discourse. Yet the experiences of African students reveal how deeply racial perceptions can shape reactions, even when the immediate issue appears to be religious practice. Similar prayers conducted by non-Black Muslims in the same environment reportedly did not provoke the same hostility, highlighting how skin color altered the meaning of the act itself. This moment resonates strongly with the patterns already described throughout the story. Just as in housing markets, workplaces, or public spaces elsewhere, the students' treatment was shaped by long-standing ideas about who belongs and who does not. Their Blackness transformed them into symbols of outsiders, regardless of their status as students, guests, or fellow believers. In this sense, the incident becomes another chapter in a broader narrative, where Black identity is repeatedly framed as disruptive or unwelcome. The emotional impact of such experiences extends far beyond the immediate event. For young people far from home, education abroad often represents hope, opportunity, and trust in a shared global future. When that trust is broken through targeted hostility, the damage is not only physical or psychological, but deeply symbolic. It sends a message that achievement, discipline, and peaceful intent may not be enough to overcome deeply ingrained biases. Linking this incident back to the earlier discussions of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa reveals a troubling consistency. Whether through exclusion, stereotyping, or direct confrontation, Black Muslims frequently encounter layers of marginalization that compound one another. Faith does not shield them from racial judgment, and shared religion does not guarantee solidarity. Instead, race often becomes the dominant lens through which their presence is interpreted. What makes this realization particularly unsettling is how ordinary the circumstances were. There was no provocation, no challenge to authority, no public disruption. The students were simply visible. That visibility alone was enough to trigger hostility, reinforcing the idea that anti-Blackness does not always require conflict to surface. It often needs only proximity and difference. By placing this incident within the wider arc of the story, its significance becomes clearer. It is not an isolated tragedy, nor a misunderstanding between communities, but another reflection of how global hierarchies of race operate across cultural and religious lines. The same assumptions that shape media portrayals, labor systems, and social interactions can also erupt into moments of collective aggression when left unexamined. This chapter of the narrative reminds us that anti-Blackness is not limited by geography, belief, or tradition. It adapts, attaches itself to local tensions, and reveals itself in moments when empathy fails. Understanding these moments, and how they connect to a larger global pattern, is essential for grasping the full scope of the issue and why it continues to demand attention. As the story moves deeper into the social fabric of everyday life, attention turns to the quieter forces that shape perception long before a person ever speaks or acts. Beyond laws, institutions, or isolated incidents, media, language, and cultural practices play a powerful role in teaching societies how to see one another. In parts of the Arab world, these forces are often described as reinforcing ideas that place blackness at the margins while elevating standards rooted in European aesthetics. From an early age, many people absorb lessons not through formal instruction, but through repetition. Television screens, advertisements, films, and music videos consistently send messages about who is admired, who is respected, and who is rarely centered. In numerous popular productions, lighter skin is repeatedly associated with beauty, success, romance, and authority, while darker skin appears far less often, and when it does, it is frequently tied to limited or subordinate roles. These portrayals are not always overt or malicious, yet their cumulative effect is powerful, shaping expectations about worth and status without a single word needing to be spoken. Language reinforces these visuals in subtle but lasting ways. Everyday expressions, idioms, and jokes passed down through generations can carry meanings that outlive their origins. Words associated with darkness are often linked to misfortune, fear, or inferiority, while whiteness becomes shorthand for purity or virtue. Over time, such linguistic patterns become normalized, repeated casually in conversation, humor, or storytelling, rarely questioned by those who use them. For those on the receiving end, however, these words serve as constant reminders of how deeply embedded certain hierarchies remain. Cultural traditions also play a role in sustaining these ideas. Beauty standards, marriage preferences, and social status are often influenced by long-standing assumptions about skin tone. Lighter complexions may be praised as signs of refinement or prestige, while darker skin is quietly discouraged or framed as something to be corrected, hidden, or explained. These preferences do not exist in isolation. They intersect with class, nationality, and lineage, creating layered systems of inclusion and exclusion that feel natural to those who benefit from them. When viewed alongside the personal testimonies already explored in this narrative, these patterns begin to align. The difficulties faced by Black Africans in housing, employment, and social life are not merely the result of individual bias, but reflections of broader cultural conditioning. Media images inform expectation, language shapes attitudes, and cultural practices legitimize unequal treatment, all working together to maintain a social order that often goes unquestioned. What makes this dynamic particularly enduring is its invisibility to those who are not affected by it. Because these messages are woven into entertainment, humor, and tradition, they are easily dismissed as harmless or insignificant. Yet for those who are consistently portrayed as secondary, invisible, or undesirable, the impact is deeply personal. It influences how they are seen by others and, over time, how they are expected to see themselves. Connecting this chapter to the broader global context discussed earlier reveals striking parallels. Just as anti-Blackness adapts across Europe and Asia, it also manifests locally through culturally specific symbols and narratives. The form may change, but the function remains the same, reinforcing a hierarchy in which blackness is devalued and whiteness, or proximity to it, is elevated. By examining media, language, and cultural practices together, the story underscores how discrimination can persist even without explicit hostility. These systems do not require active intent to function. They rely on repetition, silence, and familiarity. Understanding this helps explain why change is often slow and why confronting these issues can feel uncomfortable. It requires questioning not only institutions, but habits of thought that have been inherited and normalized over generations. In bringing these elements into focus, the narrative does not seek to condemn culture, but to illuminate it. Only by recognizing how deeply these messages run can societies begin to imagine alternatives, where representation is broader, language is more mindful, and cultural pride no longer depends on exclusion. To understand why certain attitudes feel so deeply ingrained, the story must now move further back in time, beyond modern media and social habits, into the historical foundations that shaped them. The patterns seen today did not emerge suddenly. They were constructed over centuries through systems of labor, power, and belief that left lasting marks on North Africa and the vast Saharan regions beyond. History, in this sense, does not simply explain the past, it helps decode the present. For many centuries, trans-Saharan trade routes connected North Africa, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. Alongside gold, salt, and goods, human beings were also moved across these routes. Enslaved Africans became an integral part of the economic and social structures that developed in desert and semi-desert zones. In these environments, labor was not incidental. It was essential. Survival itself depended on intensive physical work, from digging wells and maintaining irrigation systems to cultivating oozes and tending livestock in harsh conditions. As a result, systems of slavery in the Sahara evolved into particularly rigid and enduring forms. Unlike domestic servitude in some northern urban centers, slavery in Saharan regions often became hereditary. Status was passed down through generations, binding families to roles they had no power to escape. Over time, blackness itself became associated with enslavement, while lighter skin came to symbolize authority, ownership, and religious legitimacy. These associations hardened into social hierarchies that outlived the formal structures that created them. Even as laws changed and empires fell, the underlying logic remained embedded in social relations. This historical division between northern coastal regions and southern Saharan zones is crucial to understanding how racial hierarchies developed unevenly across North Africa. In many northern areas, enslaved Africans were more likely to be absorbed into households and urban life, sometimes gaining limited mobility over time. In the Sahara, however, where entire local economies depended on enslaved labor, the system was more brutal and resistant to change. Black communities became central to production while remaining excluded from power, a contradiction that reinforced the idea of inherent inequality. Religious narratives and cultural reinterpretations further reinforced these hierarchies. Over generations, histories were retold in ways that framed domination as natural or divinely sanctioned. Intellectual traditions emerged that positioned certain groups as rightful authorities while casting others as perpetual dependents. These narratives did not always operate openly, but they shaped collective memory and social norms, influencing how communities understood identity, worth, and belonging. When viewed alongside the contemporary experiences already described in this story, the connection becomes clearer. The exclusion faced by Black Africans in housing, employment, and representation does not arise in a vacuum. It echoes older systems in which access to space, security, and dignity was unevenly distributed along racial lines. The silence or denial surrounding these issues today mirrors earlier eras when inequality was normalized rather than questioned. What makes this legacy especially persistent is its integration into everyday life. Descendants of enslaved communities in Saharan regions often remain geographically concentrated, socially marginalized, and underrepresented in positions of influence. Their presence is familiar, yet their histories are rarely acknowledged openly. This quiet continuity allows inequality to persist without constant enforcement, sustained instead by custom and expectation. Placing this historical analysis within the broader narrative shifts the conversation away from isolated blame and towards structural understanding. It shows how the media portrayals linguistic patterns and social exclusions discussed earlier are not random, but part of a long continuum. The past supplies the framework through which the present is interpreted. By tracing these roots carefully, the story emphasizes that confronting modern discrimination requires more than surface-level change. It requires an honest engagement with history, including the parts that challenge collective self-images. Only by recognizing how deeply these hierarchies were built can societies begin to dismantle them, replacing inherited assumptions with more equitable ways of seeing one another. As the story reaches its conclusion, the focus turns to the present moment, where history, culture, and policy converge in ways that are impossible to ignore. Modern systems were often introduced with promises of order, protection, and progress. Yet in practice, many have reproduced older hierarchies under new names. The kafala labor framework stands as one such example, frequently cited by human rights observers as a system that places disproportionate power in the hands of employers while leaving migrant workers, many of them Black Africans, vulnerable to abuse, restriction of movement, and social invisibility. Even when laws exist on paper, lived reality often tells a different story. Recent events in Tunisia further underscore this contradiction between reform and reality. Tunisia is frequently highlighted for passing progressive legislation against racism, becoming the first Arab country to formally criminalize racial discrimination. On the surface, this represents a meaningful step forward, a public acknowledgement that racism exists and must be addressed. Yet the experiences of Black Africans within the country reveal how fragile legal protections can be when political rhetoric, economic pressure, and social prejudice collide. Episodes of violence, forced displacement, and fear following inflammatory public discourse exposed how quickly underlying tensions can surface, despite years of advocacy and reform. What links these modern examples to the historical and cultural analysis explored earlier is not simply injustice, but continuity. The same assumptions that once justified enslavement or exclusion now reappear in subtler forms through labor systems that limit autonomy, through selective enforcement of laws, and through narratives that frame Black presence as a problem rather than a contribution. Structural racism rarely announces itself openly. It operates through policies, practices, and silences that allow inequality to persist without constant confrontation. Yet this story is not meant to end in despair. Awareness itself is a powerful turning point. Across the regions discussed, activists, scholars, journalists, and ordinary people continue to challenge these systems, often at great personal risk. Their work reminds us that structures created by human beings can also be changed by human beings. Legal reforms matter, but they must be accompanied by political will, cultural reflection, and genuine accountability if they are to move beyond symbolism. This narrative has sought to connect past and present, personal experience and global patterns, to show that anti-Black racism is neither accidental nor inevitable. It is learned, reinforced, and sustained, but it can also be unlearned. Understanding how deeply these systems run is the first step toward dismantling them, replacing inherited hierarchies with a vision rooted in dignity and shared humanity. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and engage with this story. Conversations like this only continue when people are willing to confront complexity rather than turn away from it. If you found this exploration meaningful and believe these perspectives deserve wider attention, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep thoughtful, challenging conversations alive, and it allows more stories like this to be told.